Welcome to the Vow from Hiroshima, Film, Advocacy, and Nuclear Disarmament. We'll spend the next hour more deeply examining the effects of nuclear weapons on our lives then and now. The Vow from Hiroshima is a deeply moving film focused on Setsuko Thurlow's lifelong campaign to rid the world of nuclear arms. She has played an indispensable role in informing the world about the horrors of nuclear war and in securing the adoption of the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The film reveals her deep humanity, empathy, and courage. We regret that because of illness, she cannot be here with us today. We are joined today by Rachel Bronson, Susan Strickler, and Michi Takeuchi to discuss the documentary and its relevance today. I'll now hand things over to today's moderator and co-sponsor, Dr. Fred Dickinson, who is a professor of Japanese history and director of the Center for East Asian Studies here at Penn. Born in Tokyo and raised in Kanazawa and Kyoto, Japan, he writes and teaches about modern Japan on empire, politics, and nationalism in East Asia and the Pacific, and on world history. He is the author of many books and is currently working on a global history of modern Japan. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours, Fred.
Super. Thank you very much, LaShawn, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Para World House. It's really a great pleasure to be able to join this Global Lens Series event today. Our discussion is also part of the Japan Global Issues film series, which the Penn Center for East Asian Studies launched just this year as a way of highlighting Japanese films with major global implications. We had our last film just in March about Japan's wartime comfort women issue, but we look forward today to another engaging discussion of a key contemporary global concern through the prism of modern Japan. Before we do proceed, I'd like to also thank the Japan Foundation, whose generous institutional project support grant made this new series possible. I guess I should probably mention Sumiko Hatakeyama also, right? She's a graduate student of Susan Lindy. Susan Lindy here in the History and Sociology of Science department, who actually knows this dynamic duo and suggested that we do this film and this event. So Sumiko cannot be here with us today, but this is for you too, Sumiko. Okay, now onto the program. We're very delighted to have present here, as LaShawn just said, for our discussion, the director and producer of the Vow from Hiroshima, Michi Takeuchi and Susan Strickler. And let me first say to both of you, big congratulations for this wonderful film. It's quite a coup, and I really look forward to sort of talking about it with you today. We're also very honored to have zooming in with us today someone very intimately involved in global discussions on nuclear weapons, the CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Rachel Bronson. You can see her up here. We can see her over there. So she's in here sort of serving double for today. But basically, this will work by me introducing each one of our speakers in turn. They will give about 5 minutes of remarks, and then we'll have a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes, followed by another 20 minutes of interaction with the audience. So please look forward to that. Okay, so first I'd like to present to you Michi Takeuchi, for whom, of course, you know, this story of Hiroshima is just as personal as it is for the star of the film, Setsuko Thurlow. Ms. Takeuchi is the creator and producer of The Vow from Hiroshima. She is originally from Hiroshima herself. She now lives in New York City, where she works as a media business consultant. She's also a fellow of the Youth Arts New York Hibakusha Stories, a UN NGO and member organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, that is ICAN. Which, as you know, if you saw the film, it was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. So please, Michi, please give us your comments on the film. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Dr. Dickinson. And also, thank you so much for creating this amazing opportunity for us to share our time together. And I'm so happy to be here at the center of the Eastern Asian Studies and also the William World House. Thank you. And also I feel so humbled to be in the company of you, Dr. Bronson. I am so happy to be with you here and have the opportunity to have a discussion about our film, The Vow from Hiroshima. As Dr. Dickinson said, I live in New York and I'm originally from Hiroshima. As you might have seen the photograph, the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are usually represented by the image of the powerfully gigantic mushroom clouds. I have always thought the image to be very abstract and impersonal. Moreover, it does not convey anything about what really happened in the city as a result of that detonation. Those of us who come from a city under the mushroom cloud, we know what really has happened, and I feel a responsibility to share the human side of the story, the profound human suffering that is the result of the use of nuclear weapons. My grandparents and my mother survived the atomic bombing, and yet I came to activism rather late in my life, about 10 years ago. Until then, my life was all about focused on running my business in New York City. Meeting Setsuko Thurlow was an epiphany for me, and getting to know her made a huge impact on my perspectives about my family history. In fact, Setsuko encouraged me to do some research about my grandfather. I was raised in a very medical family. My grandfather, my father were both surgeons, and now my 3 brothers are doctors as well. Growing up in Hiroshima, I was surrounded by medical doctors who had committed themselves to the treatment of atomic bomb survivors, Hibakusha. As I became more and more involved in the advocacy, I learned that physicians' organizations had played a critical role in the long years of peace activism. And that led to the enactment of TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I was very moved and comforted by this realization. I began to understand the significance of my grandfather's experience as the head of Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital at the time of the atomic explosion. His was the first case study. He was seriously injured himself, and yet he had to give directives to his surviving medical staff, many of whom were also injured. Nuclear weapons devastate life and the environment for generations. They pose an existential threat to humanity. Even rescue teams that respond in the early stages of this extreme emergency cannot avoid death and critical injury. This is a reality that we all need to remember. I have been delighted to do the screenings of our film with organizations such as IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, including medical students. This film is their story too. So What can we do to help people consider the world without nuclear weapons and avoid the probability of a nuclear catastrophe? We can do it through education. And we are doing that now with screenings at high schools and universities in New York City. And of course, here we are in this wonderful campus in Philadelphia. Seeing this film inspires students to want to learn more and get involved in doing something. It's so rewarding and hopeful. For them, this work is all about saving the planet. I am excited to exchange opinions with you today.
Great, thank you so much. Next, I'd like to turn to Susan Strickler, a director and producer of the film. Ms. Strickler has had a distinguished 22-year career, is that correct? Something like that. In television and theater, she has directed over 750 one-hour-long episodes of such familiar daytime dramas as The Young and the Restless, Guiding Light, and Another World, and is the recipient of both a Daytime Emmy Award and a Directors Guild of America Award. So we're very happy to have her speak to us about her experience with this film. Susan.
Thank you, Dr. Dickinson, for hosting a screening of our film, The Vow from Hiroshima, here at Perry World House. I can't think of a more appropriate place for it to be shared and discussed, and I'm very interested to hear what Dr. Bronson's perspective on the issues in our film as we move on in the discussion. The most common question that directors get asked is, why did you make this film? And as with many transformational experiences in life, I didn't really plan to make this documentary. I wouldn't exactly say I fell into it, but more that the situation I found myself in demanded that I take it up. Michi and I are members of Hibakusha Stories, which is a brilliant program that brings survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to New York City to share their testimonies with high school and college students. The young people were so open and moved to hear about the horrors and loss that Setsuko and the other survivors had to endure. But adjacent to that school program, and something I confess I wasn't entirely aware of at the time, the nuclear disarmament movement was newly focused on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And there were 3 international conferences where diplomats and members of civil society gathered to discuss how to move forward with this new approach. In December of 2014, Setsuko was the keynote speaker at the last of these conferences in Vienna, which I also attended. I heard her speak in front of school groups many times before, but in Vienna, I witnessed the effect that her speech and call to action had on this collection of powerful and influential people. Setsuko felt elated that there was real progress happening in Vienna, but she'd also been on the road on a speaking tour for 6 weeks prior to that, all over the world. And I have to say, she was exhausted at that point and didn't know how much longer she could keep up this intense work schedule. She was 82 at the time. So I casually suggested that perhaps making a documentary about her life and her work would be a useful tool to help her reach more people than she could just personally appearing at conferences and that sort of thing. And mind you, at the time, I wasn't really suggesting that I would direct it. I just thought this might be something that she could pursue, separate, as she was trying to figure out, should I write a book? What should I do? And it just felt like it might be a more immediate way for her to reach more people quickly. Now, in January of 2015, a couple months later, Setsuko and some of her activist Hibakusha colleagues were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Then later that spring, there was going to be an NPT, a Nuclear Nonproliferation Conference at the UN, which only meets every 5 years, and she was going to be an important speaker there as well. And then later that year, in August, she was flying to Hiroshima for the first time in quite a while to attend the ceremonies around the 70th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb. And I just looked at that and I thought, gosh, if there is ever going to be a documentary made, we have to cover these important events. And so I spoke to Michi and a camera person, friend of ours, and suddenly we're just up and running. We didn't have a business plan, we had no financing, but we just set to the task immediately. As is the case with many documentaries, the story you initially set out to tell has many unexpected twists and turns. Things that seem like devastating delays later are actually blessings, because as new events unfold, they can shape the larger narrative of your film. And docs also typically take much longer than anybody thinks they're going to. So we didn't think it was going to take 5 years of filming and post-production, but it's just the nature of the beast. All of this was true for us with all the twists and turns. We certainly never expected the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, to be as successful as it was as quickly. And then it was passed at the UN in 2017. And we certainly didn't expect, and what a great surprise, to have ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, win the Nobel Peace Prize. And then on top of that, they asked Setsuko to give one of the 2 Nobel lectures, accepting the award on behalf of all the Hibakusha. So, you know, this was like a fairy tale movie ending for Setsuko after years of rigorous advocacy and personal sacrifice. But as we worked on the film, it became clear that Michi's family's history provided an interesting contrast to Setsuko's story. Setsuko, with a lifelong mission to speak out about the experience to prevent another bombing. And then there's Michi's mother, who was a survivor, who lived in a stoic silence. Michi was very reluctant to switch from being a producer to actually being in the film, and it took quite a bit of convincing, but eventually I won. And because I really did feel it was an important contrast. And framed by her close relationship with Setsuko, I felt it added an emotional thread that draws people into the story. So that's how the film that you all watched came to be. And thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much. And finally, let me present to you Rachel Bronson. Ms. Bronson is president and CEO, as I said earlier, of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, where she oversees the bulletin's publishing programs, the management of the Doomsday Clock, and a growing list of activities around nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Before joining the Bulletin, Bronson served as the vice president of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And before that, and this is really my favorite part of her resume, she was a Penn undergraduate majoring in history, my home department, and working with one of my very close former colleagues, Dr. Mark Trachtenberg. So what's not better than that? Needless to say, Rachel is a very strong friend of both Perry Worldhouse and Penn, and we're very delighted to have her present to us her thoughts on this film. Please, Rachel.
Thank you. How's the sound? Can you all hear me okay? Well, what a delight to be here. Really, what an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you for including me. Susan and Michi, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. To the students and Penn community online and there actually a big hello. I wish I could be there with you today, and go Quakers. I think I'm probably here to contextualize the amazing film that I hope you all got a chance to see. And if you didn't, make sure you do go out and see it. It's important. It's important in terms of the issues and important in terms of the people you meet in that film. Many of them are still very active in the conversation today. So well worth your time. It is troubling, it is painful, it is difficult to recognize how current these issues are today. We sit here today under the threat of Vladimir Putin, who is being very clear that nuclear weapon use is back on the table. Many of us who have looked at this issues for some time know it's always on the table. Accidents are always possible. The US stands on hair trigger alert. The notion of nuclear weapons being used by accident or intentionally is really just minutes away at any given point. But very recently, when we've had them threatened and had them brought on the table, it's made it more urgent and more important. And so I'm sure many of you sitting in this room are thinking your way through the role of nuclear weapons and what do we need to do to make sure that they become less threatening and not more so. So just to step back a little bit, over the last 10 years or so, the threat of nuclear use, whether by accident or intention, I think most experts have thought most likely to happen accidentally, has been increasing. And why is that so? Why do we say that the threat is growing? Why do we move the doomsday clock closer to midnight? There's a number of reasons. One, over the last number of years, we've seen a real deterioration between US and Russian relations. Still two very important countries in this conversation, the two countries with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenals. So those two countries are really key to thinking through the future of nuclear weapons. And when there's a deterioration in relations between the two, it makes everything more dangerous and more unstable. That is not news at this point where we sit, but that's been a steady process really over the last 10 years plus. Another reason that we have been kind of standing on this very dangerous precipice is the investment that every nuclear power has been making in their nuclear arsenals. So there was a period where we did see a reduction in spending and certainly a reduction in the arsenals. And I think we heard that from Eric Schlosser, I think in the movie that you all watched. But we did see from the height of the Cold War to really where we are now, a decrease in the size of the arsenal. But over the last 10, 15 years or so, and let's say 10 years, every nuclear country has been investing to make their arsenals more usable, not less usable. The United States is on the verge of spending $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years in upgrading its nuclear arsenal. Some of that is to keep it safe from accident, but a lot of that is really to increase the power and usability of the weapons themselves. The Russians have gone through their own modernization. The Brits are spending increasingly. The Chinese are spending. And Pakistan has the fastest growing arsenal on the planet. India is spending. So across the board, we're seeing investments that suggest that nuclear weapons are more and not less useful. It's terrifying. We're notwithstanding statements to the contrary, that's where the investments are being made. And the doctrine is changing. The doctrine is changing to make it more usable. So the United States doctrine is changing away from that we would only respond, that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons was to be used if a nuclear weapon was used against the United States. That notion of sole purpose is gone. And increasingly over the last number of years, you've seen in the US's posture, the notion that we would use nuclear weapons if we felt that there was an existential threat, including by suggestion if there was a massive cyber attack. You've seen the Russians actually using that kind of terminology recently about when they would use nuclear weapons. They would use it if there was a threat to the Russian homeland. They've kind of been a little fuzzy about existential or not. The Russians actually train their militaries to operate in nuclear environments. We've watched them do those exercises. And the Chinese, who are so far behind us, so are investing as well to figure out how they can secure their arsenal in case there's some sort of attack. So for all of these reasons, we're in this environment that is more dangerous when it comes to nuclear weapons and really requires your attention. It's an important issue. So I want to be mindful of time, but let me just then situate where the TPNW and where some of the ideas sit that you heard about in the film and why they're so important. Because really everything is up for discussion and debate. This is a really important time to be thinking about these issues, studying them, notwithstanding the fact because of the current news and the current environment. But should we get past this, and I imagine we will, it's going to be required that strategic thinkers think about this environment we are and how we can get back to a place that makes these weapons less usable. So there's some good news stories. And that's what you saw in the film. The TPNW, the international movement and attention and grassroots organization behind what you saw about this commitment to making nuclear weapons illegal and banning them. We haven't seen that kind of groundswell for a long time. There's still a long ways to go, but you heard that in the film that you saw, this notion that we're at the beginning of the end. There is reason to believe that that kind of activism, that kind of engagement, your engagement on the issues can and will make a difference. And so we have that on the table. We have that infrastructure, we have that architecture, we have that global furniture that we can use to build upon. We're not starting from scratch. I want you to think about that, the TPNW, because it's very different from the arms control architecture that we've been building over the past throughout the Cold War. There's something very different. This is the numbers that you saw at the UN voting against those with nuclear weapons, saying we need to delegitimize these weapons. So as you think through it, what kind of agreements will be required as we move forward to delegitimize these weapons, to reduce the funding that is going into them, to make them unusable, to make them weapons that are more dangerous to those who have them than to others. The other thing that's changing, and we need your thinking about it, is we have very much moved to a multipolar environment. Many of the theories around deterrence were really built when it was the bipolar, the US-Soviet struggle. Now, as we look across the globe, we have new actors. Not only are there 5 Security Council states that have them, but we've moved into where North Korea now has them. And all this attention on Iran. We know that the situation that we're in, as those who've given up nuclear weapons and those who haven't, it's a big debate, right? How are we going to bring all of these powers into some sort of agreement or arms control environment or disarmament spiral, if you will? And so you'll remember a few years ago when President Trump was saying we can't sign certain arms control agreements, we have to bring in the Chinese, can't be between the Russians. There's something actually important to that. He wasn't able to figure out how to do it. But how will we build a global architecture that reduces the power of nuclear weapons, that does involve not only the Russians and the Americans, the two that will be most important to that, but what role for the Chinese, what role for the Pakistanis, what role for the Indians, what role for the North Koreans, what role for the Israelis? How do we bring them into this? So the question that the president was asking, which is how do we update this architecture to the 21st century, was the correct one. Blowing up the arms control that we did have, or the agreements that we did have in the hopes of a new one, wasn't really the right approach. But the question's a really important one. I want you also to think about what role nuclear weapons are playing in today's conflict. There's a real debate right now. Is today's situation between the Americans and the Russians, the Ukrainians and the Russians, does that prove that nuclear weapons are useless, right? We're hostage in many ways to each other having nuclear weapons. It's preventing us from doing certain things that we might want to do. Are they useless? Or are they useful? Is it actually keeping the United States and the Soviets from going head to head in this fear that more damage will be inflicted both on Ukraine, but the world as a whole? we'll hear a lot of conversations today about kind of the dangers of them, but really think through it. Because if you believe that deterrence has shown itself to be ineffective and useless, think your way through that argument, because there'll be some who'll be arguing that it reinstantiates deterrence. It's an active debate right now. It is very important to get to a place that we can figure out how to make them useless. But that is very much on the table as a strategic discussion for you all to help us figure out, because these are the questions that are going to be with us moving forward. So Brad, I might stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That really gives us a lot of important food for thought, particularly in terms of the context. We don't have that much time for our moderated discussion, but I guess I'll have a time to maybe just throw out one question, if I may. And it strikes me that, I mean, this is a very great trio that we have here. All of you have been working in some fashion for lack of a better term, a peace movement, and getting on board at various points in your career. And I guess that just sort of raises the interesting, I mean, and you're coming at it a certain different ways. Since we have our two artists here up on the stage, I would like to just ask them, you know, how do you see, so your story was very interesting, Susan, about, you know, that was going to be my first question, just sort of articulate how did it come about and where did it actually go? Because it's always a story of, well, that wasn't exactly what it was supposed to go, right? So you conceived of this basically 2014. It came out in 2020. We are now at 2022. It seems almost, I mean, a very different world than 2014. So I guess my question to both of you, or maybe it's not, you know, so how do you see the peace movement, so-called, in which you are a part of? How do you see your role? How do you see the film holding up? How do you see your next move after this? To both.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you for a great question. As far as I am concerned, as far as my role is concerned, as someone who comes from the family who had a personal experience of receiving end of the nuclear weapons detonation in a very personal way, I feel I just need to keep talking about it. And since nuclear weapon is not exactly in our daily conversation, in the United States particularly, I feel, and I really feel that a lot of American youth are not learning about what exactly happened when it was used. So I really feel I need to keep on talking, sharing with the young people who don't know. But once they do know, they're gonna be mad, they're gonna be upset, I think, and they wanna do something about it. It's gonna take a long, long time to make the final change, but I think it's just the beginning of our collective efforts.
Yeah, I agree with Michi. I think educating people about the issue is really, you know, kind of the most important thing. I feel from what my personal experience is that Americans are taught next to nothing about the nuclear bomb. I think it takes up about maybe a paragraph in most high school history books. It's like, you know, we got the bomb, we used it to end the war, we saved hundreds of thousands of lives, whatever, which is a myth, and that was a good thing. And nobody ever really examines what the actual impact of it was in the country. Most people don't know, for example, that the US occupied Japan for 7 years and rebuilt the country. I mean, it's just, the lack of information is huge. Now, in light of what's going on right now, I just have a shocking thing that happened to me the other day. I saw somebody from the entertainment business I hadn't seen in 30 years, and he asked me what I'd been up to, and I mentioned I made this film. And he said, yeah, that sounds like it's not really relevant. It's about history, and what's your angle? What's your hook on this? And I said, are you not paying attention? Like, you know, Putin's threatening us with nuclear weapons and you don't think this is relevant? I mean, I just don't, you know, so, and I feel like that's the majority of the country. Now, obviously, you know, here we are at the University of Pennsylvania, you guys are probably the exception, but I'm just constantly shocked. What I think is brilliant, and I'll just make this one point, is that ICAN went about getting the TPNW to pass, even though all the nuclear states and people under the nuclear umbrella of the United States boycotted the discussion and all the meetings about it and creating the treaty. But what ICAN was brilliant about was they convinced the rest of the world that if there was a nuclear detonation, it wouldn't just affect the US and Russia, it wouldn't just affect Pakistan and India if it was there, it affects the entire world. What happens in terms of nuclear fallout and you know, the blocking of the sun and agriculture and radiation all over the world, it affects everybody, which is how they have now managed to get the treaty ratified by, I think we're at 56, 57 nations. And these are countries that in the past would have said, this has nothing to do with us. These are superpower issues. So, you know, I think this is a very important shift. And we just need to keep talking about it and get more people to understand that this is how we make change.
If I may, I mean, what you say about actually, you know, the response of your colleague is sort of, I mean, I guess not surprising, but disturbing. It raises the point of, you know, the medium. So, you know, documentary films, yeah, they work very well in an educational setting. But number one, who wants to pay the money for it, because there's no money in it, right? And what are you going to do other than that? I mean, Rachel has the great sort of luxury to be at, you know, a well-established journal since 1945 with a doomsday clock. I mean, presumably you have to sort of fight for your, you know, what you need as well, Rachel, but perhaps not as much as poor documentary filmmakers. I guess the question is then, what do you see? I mean, is there a sequel here, or can there be a sequel, and or what is the place of documentary film in this larger struggle, aside from simply keeping the voice of Setsuko and Michi to a certain extent alive?
I've never considered a sequel. Let me just say that. But yeah, I mean, again, there's not massive interest. You know, this has been a struggle. And also we were supposed to launch our film, and literally when we were going to have our world premiere, COVID hit like 10 days before. So all the film festivals that we had scheduled were shut down. And, you know, so we've been struggling to make up ground since then. But I do think that there is interest in the academic world, and I'm grateful for that. And we are making some headway. And there are a lot of organizations now too that are peace-oriented, that also are interested in you know, and making requests to see the film and have discussions about it. But yeah, I mean, that's why I have to say, Setsuko always says, you know, we have to stay positive. We have to stay hopeful. I don't know how she's done it. You know, she has done this her entire life, and God bless her, but she still fights the fight and is still working now in Canada to try and get them to acknowledge that the treaty exists and that they should sign it. But, you know, they won't, Trudeau won't even respond to letters that she's written him. So, you know, I don't know how people stay hopeful, but we just have to keep working at it.
And also, one thing that I learned about working with the activists, and also, of course, the diplomats and so on, one thing that I really learned was that everybody is very optimistic. I would be more like, oh my gosh, this is such a complicated issue. When can we even possibly resolve this? But being among activists like Setsuko or others, they really strongly believe it's gonna get done. It's gonna take a long time, but it's gonna get done. There is this amazing belief. And because of that, I feel it may take a long time, but unless we start now, nothing is going to happen, right? So that's
Right.
how I feel.
Thank you. Okay, I guess we need to move on to our discussion now with the audience. We do have maybe 12 minutes or so. So let's open up the floor. Please, if you do have a question, raise your hand, and then we'll have you go to the mic. Is that the procedure, Tom? Yeah. There's a mic right over here, so please go to the mic and identify yourself first. Do we have any takers? Yes, go ahead, if you wouldn't mind relocating for a second. And just identify yourself first, and we'll take it from there.
Hello there, my name is Jared Rosen. I'm a research fellow here at Perry World House. One question I have for everyone, and I think Ms. Strickler touched on this earlier, but what are some critical pieces of disinformation or myths that surround non-proliferation or nuclear weapons or even Hiroshima?
Well, in my experience, and I'll try and be brief about this. My dad was on one of the boats that was heading to Japan to invade during World War II. And I read Hiroshima when I was 13 or 14 by John Hersey. And I read it and I was like, I didn't have the word that this was a war crime, but that was my reaction. That was my feeling about it. And we argued bitterly about this, for many years. But I have since, having been in this community of activists and whatnot, found out that, for example, our generals who fought the war in Japan were furious that we dropped the bomb. They felt like we had won the war, and why did we go and drop this bomb there? Because it was unnecessary. But the people involved in developing the war, the Manhattan Project, and spent, I think in those days, Rachel probably knows this better than I, but like $1 trillion developing it. And they really dropped these bombs not for Japan to surrender, but rather it was the beginning of the Cold War, to send the message to the Soviet Union, you guys better not mess with us, look what we got. And by the way, the Russians were approaching Japan. Japan was trying to surrender. They didn't want to become a part of the Soviet, they didn't want to be a satellite of the Soviet Union. But we didn't accept any communication offers that they had made to try and surrender until we got to show off our bombs. And there's a lot of history to support that that's really why we dropped it. It wasn't to bring Japan to their knees. And the amount of people that would have died is also, that was a PR campaign by the White House. They made the generals who wrote an op-ed that said we didn't need to do this, we didn't need to drop these bombs. And they said, you may never say anything about that again. And then they started this big PR campaign about how many lives were saved by dropping the bombs. So, I was shocked, but that is what I know. Rachel, you can go ahead and argue if that isn't what you know, but.
Was your question about the actual bombing, or was it more about proliferation?
More about proliferation, but that's also a great anecdote.
Okay. Rachel, you want to answer the proliferation issue?
My thought in terms of answering that question is on kind of mis and disinformation. I was thinking more in the current context, and I think it may be useful for the audience to think this through. The Russians said that they put their nuclear weapons on high alert, right? That started a whole conversation about their possible use, and it was really terrifying. There was nothing that we saw, whether it was the Pentagon or other intelligence, to suggest they did anything with their nuclear weapons. And so they were using their nuclear weapons as a propaganda and a terrorism stunt that really worked. But that's when you didn't see us responding, the United States, you didn't see us adding to the alerts that we had. And thankfully there were cooler heads that prevailed. But it was absolutely an intended misinformation in terms of what was happening in Russia, and it was designed to terrorize us through the threat of nuclear weapons.
Great. Do we have another from the floor? Perhaps we do have some questions online. If there's no one from the floor right now, go ahead. Just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm a student I'm a junior in the Asian Studies department. My question is, what are the obstacles that you guys meet when spreading this idea or the message to the US students or like people in the society in general? And what are some ways that you think are efficient in dealing with those obstacles? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite.
For educating students, what sort of pushback do you have? Is that what you're asking? Like when you're giving when you're talking about your experience, if any? Things that you find difficult to actually get through, that it doesn't seem to register, doesn't seem to sink in, or does it always sink in because it's a personal story?
Thank you for the question. My personal experience so far, I haven't really received any pushback kind of a responses. I probably need to be showing more in different schools and different states, but New York City, it's a little bit different environment, I think.
Are you getting reaction that you expect these days, or are there reactions that you don't expect? Have the reactions changed over time?
Okay, we haven't, the last showing was like 3 weeks ago, right, at high school student. I don't think the responses were any different from, let's say, 3 months ago, if that's the question. Yes.
Yeah, and is the reaction, so we saw some images of the reaction in the film, and they're clearly sort of shocked and appalled. Is that's typically what you're getting, and you seem to be actually getting your point across, I guess.
Yes, and often the young people's responses are rather emotional. It
Okay.
really seems to appeal to their feelings.
Interesting. So that really raises an interesting sort of the power of art or documentary film or memoir as a mechanism or as a tool in the peace movement. Obviously, it's something that you bring to the table that maybe you wouldn't have another. Right. Yeah.
You know, we intended, you know, I think there was a bit of people who were encouraging us to be more, talk about more policy and whatnot in our film. And we really wanted to tell a personal story, not one that was just filled with discussion of who's got how much hardware and what kind of destruction. I had some people say it's not, you don't show enough violence from the impact of the nuclear weapons, but we chose to use drawings and the Maruki panels and stuff like that, because we want to be able to have younger people see it and not have nightmares, you know, and yet still understand the violence of it. But we really wanted to tell an emotional story because that's what people respond to. You can show graphs and charts and tell people what's going to happen when there's the next nuclear bomb, but it's all abstractions. But if you tell us an emotional story, it bridges to, you know, into that place where people, you know, it becomes their family, you know, it could have been their family and or their experience. And I think that that's really where change happens. So
there are a couple actually related questions online here, if I may. One is just, so does that emotional story that you're telling, does that change over time? In other words, you know, Hibakusha are slowly kind of disappearing. You are obviously in a film capturing it. So in a way that's great. On the other hand, will time actually sort of defeat that purpose as well? And the other sort of related question is, so are there other ways, other things that you could sort of put it in context, like that people have a remote emotional reaction to, such as climate change, that you could sort of you know, put it in, you know, most people have not survived obviously a nuclear holocaust, but many people are experiencing other issues such as climate change. Is that a strategy that you might think of using, or have you ever used in your sort of presentation?
The intersectionalism.
Other issues.
Yes, I think that because it's all connected. It's all connected, right? So it's very important to really involve different group of people who have strong belief in one's environment, climate change, pollution, national resources and so on. And I think that the nuclear disarmament activists need to really be connected to other activists as well. And this is a great timing now for all of us to get together, I feel.
Great. I think we're sort of getting to time, but maybe we have time for one more from the audience. Yes, sir, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
I'm Kamil Siddiqui, and my research is thank you very much for coming and discussing this very valid, very significant, very sensitive issue. And it's all our concern. There is nobody on this planet who is not worried about the future for the world. The climate change is an example, as you had mentioned. Also, the issue of nuclear technology. And technology can have a useful side to it. Technology can have a destructive side to it. Depends on how we use it, as a weapon or as power to benefit society and humanity. Now, even with the use of as power, for beneficial use, there's an issue of nuclear waste, which would have a half-life of 10,000 years. So we can't plan beyond 100 years or 200 years. How are we going to think about 10,000 years? So we end up in one of those situations where you have waste with everybody saying, as long as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So, but for destructive aspect, if we are looking at that, even technology or addressing climate change, they all come into this because it's an issue of conflict of interest. So what we are trying to do is resolve conflict of interest. How do we resolve it? And now we have democracy and we have authoritarianism. Authoritarianism creates all kinds of difficulties where we have no freedom of choice, no creativity, no innovation. So this raises a question which I would like to ask you, that nuclear technology has consequences, the way we use it. And to address this issue, one has to get into the question of vision and wisdom. And an example of vision is protection of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Liberty is about freedom, and which needs a free society to be possible. But that's the conundrum here. On the one side, society cannot exist without caring for the other. If we are free, however, why should we care for the other? So how do we have a free society? If we can resolve that, then I believe we can address the issue of the conflict of interest.
Thank you very much. That was a very sort of complex look at a complex problem, which is the human experience. Does anyone have any response to that?
Fred, I can take that one.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay. I think what Mr. Siddiqui points out is actually what every student in your room today should be thinking about. The advancement of science always brings real benefits and real risks. And it's the job of policymakers to balance those, to make sure that we're protected against the risks so that we can accrue the benefits. That's literally the job of everyone sitting at Perry Worldhouse, is to figure out how we advance science without just being naive cheerleaders that it can only bring us good, but without also being Luddites in the sense that it's only going to bring us problems. And so since the atom was split, there has been this struggle. The people who were creating it, who spent their lives before 1945, they didn't start their research to turn it into a weapon. They started their research because they believed that it would help cure cancer in terms of radioactive medicine, they thought it may electrify the planet in a way that could, in today's terms, would be without emitting greenhouse gases. We know we are powering spaceships to Jupiter based on that technology. At the same time, it's created the most horrific civilization-ending weapons that humans have ever confronted. And so it's our job, it's a policy job. It's not about the technology itself. Every technology is dual use. It's the job of the policymakers and others and citizens who the politicians answer to make sure that we create policies to keep us safe. That's what the TPNW is about. That's what the NPT was trying to do. That's what we have to figure out today of what that looks like in the 21st century, because we're operating as if we're still in the 20th century and we're not. And so that truly is the job of everyone sitting in Perry World House today, is to help us think through how we control the negative sides of this technology so that we can accrue the benefits that it brings.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Very well said. If I could just summarize, basically, it seems to me that it is up to the artists and the filmmakers to raise awareness, and it's up to the policymakers to come up with a real solution. Thank you all for joining us today. It was a great pleasure to have all three of these very accomplished thinkers of peace and nuclear holocaust. I would also like to thank the audience for joining us. And as always, you can access a recording of this conversation if you like with the Perry World House YouTube channel. And you can find out all about other events with Perry World House through joining the Perry World House mailing list. You can find out all about the Center for East Asian Studies events with our email list, and of course, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Links to all of these, those in the chat, to these announcements and website will be given to those online. I just want to say just before we go, Thursday this week, Perry World House will be hosting its annual Global Shifts Colloquium on Islands on the Climate Front Line, Risk and Resilience. There will be 3 public keynote programs starting at 10:15. All will be in person at Perry World House and also live streamed on Zoom. So thank you all at home for joining us. We'll say goodbye to you now. For those of you who are here in person, please come and join us in the student lounge for a grab and go snack. Thank you again for a fabulous event. Thank you so much.